feels like in 10 years' time we may be looking at Real Madrid having won 20-plus Champions Leagues.
I would like to see Vinicius Junior, if it was voted for today, win the Balon d'Or.
We could see him hit a whole new level at Real Madrid, actually.
Hello and welcome back to Monday Vibes, everybody. We are back from our week-long holiday. I had a lovely time myself. Mikey, did you have a nice time?
I did have a nice time.
Yeah.
I did have a nice time,
A successful wedding the weekend before?
Successful, yeah. Successful wedding. Also successfully watched the second half of the FA Cup final.
This guy would not stop talking about it on Saturday night.
Yeah,
you and Joe,
absolutely.
delighted.
Got to get it out there while it's still relatively fresh in the memory. All good, thanks, Diggs. Yeah, had a nice week off. What about yourself?
Yeah, it was very nice, thank you. Much needed. Nice break at home with my mum, and then came back, had a few nice days in London, and then a pretty epic Champions League final, which we might as well start with.
Yes.
Real Madrid winning their 15th Champions League, 8 more than any other side. But Mikey, unlike in previous editions and previous finals, this wasn't as one-sided potentially as it many people expected.
Well, I mean, you say that, but I mean, you know, the 2022 Champions League final was largely won by Thibaut Courtois' heroics in goal, wasn't it? You know, I think Ancelotti's Real Madrid in particular have really made a bit of a tradition now of, you know, not necessarily being the better of the two sides across the 90 minutes and yet getting the job done. You know, look back to that 2022 run where, you know, Chelsea outplayed them for large parts of that quarter final, and yet, that amazing Luka Modric assist for Rodrigo, and, you know, everything else that happened in that game. You know, Real ended up getting over the line. You think that comeback against Man City in 2022 in the semi-final, you know, Karim Benzema just coming up clutch again and again. And here it was a similar story. You know, if Karim Adeyemi can finish his dinner in the first half, then Dortmund may well go in 2-0 up. I mean, they ended the first half with 1.8 XG, which is the most XG managed by any side in the last 10 years in a Champions League final. Real Madrid didn't even manage a shot after the 15th minute up until, I think, the 49th minute. It was that Toni Kroos free kick, broke the deadlock in that sense. But there was a sense of inevitability, wasn't there? I mean, there always is with Real Madrid, but I think especially after those missed chances for Dortmund in the first half, just how much energy Dortmund were expending actually in order to be the better side. You just know that, you know, given Real Madrid's talent and given their physical shape as well, that there was always going to be at least a 10-20 minute period where it was all going to be Real Madrid. And, you know, in the end, you know, the goals were not particularly, you know, flashy ones. You know, the Carvajal header is great, but it does just come from a corner. You know, Vinicius's goal obviously comes from an Ian Maatsen mistake, and he hits it into the ground. Does he mean it? Does he not? Not really sure. So in the end, it wasn't the most spectacular finish, but, you know, this is what we've seen Real Madrid do so much now. And you know, Dani Carvajal, you know, their main goal threat on the night. I think he had about 3 shots in the end. You know, now has 6 Champions League titles. You know, more than level with, you know, the best ever. I think Kroos now has 6 as well, although he didn't. I don't think he played in the 2013 final. If I'm not
in the
mistaken,
2014 one,
or maybe it was the 2014 one.
I mean, as in, like,
I was meaning more the Bayern.
I see what you mean. Right.
But so I mean, they really are up there with the greats, and I guess the takeaway is, and, you know, it's not a new conversation, but, you know, this Real Madrid team, you know, under Zidane and then Ancelotti, or under Ancelotti then Zidane then Ancelotti again, they've effectively matched, you know, what any great Real Madrid side has ever done. And you have to say that, you know, this is a really era-defining team, even if it's not, say, a Barcelona in the early 2010s who kind of redefined, you know, football in many ways, even though it's not Pep's Man City who have changed English football forever, or even Klopp's Liverpool, who I think have been, you know, and Klopp's Dortmund, who are really highly influential in terms of silverware, in terms of achievement, in terms of the ability to adapt to changing situations. This Real Madrid team are era-defining. You know, you look at kind of Kroos, Modric, Carvajal, the longevity that they've had at the Bernabeu to remain as influential as they have been, and now you've got a 21-year-old Jude Bellingham and a 23-year-old Vinicius Junior yet to hit their prime, and and coupled with Camavinga, Tchouaméni, Rodrigo, and now Mbappé, of course, it's just like, how many more Champions Leagues are Real Madrid going to win at this point? It feels like in 10 years' time we may be looking at Real Madrid having won 20+ Champions Leagues. That's how dominant they could be, especially when you think of Pep leaving Man City most probably next season. Everywhere else, teams, the big elite teams are kind of in transition. Klopp leaving Liverpool as well. The situation at Bayern Munich. There's very little guarantee that Kompany is going to get them back to the top. Xabi Alonso will probably leave Leverkusen after next season, so chances of them becoming a real major player in the long term, I think, are relatively slim given the size of the club. It feels like the future is Real Madrid's. But I guess, Dougie, we kind of skirted over Dortmund a bit because they did still put in about as good a performance as they could have in a final, Dougie. Like, what did you make of them?
Yeah, it was amazing. I mean, it was the story really of their season, really turning it on in the Champions League, pretty disappointing in the league. But it's just frustrating. It feels like Adeyemi in particular, that is the big chance. I saw people commenting that he's gone the wrong way with his weight. He should have gone to the right or tried to finish to the right rather than bring the ball to the left. It feels like for all his physical abilities and game stretching, pace, etc., he doesn't probably have the killer instinct that maybe you'd expect or hope for a forward of his promise just yet. And he has had a difficult season in certain matches and moments and hasn't necessarily been first choice, but it was actually his substitution, I thought, for Royce in that second half that kind of sealed the tide turning completely against them. It felt like maybe Julian Brandt was probably the player to take off for Marco Reus at that moment rather than Adeyemi, who had been their crucial threat. But as I say, it's been a really difficult season for them. They finished 5th in the Bundesliga. That in any normal season wouldn't qualify for them for the Champions League. But because of their performances and other German clubs' performances in Europe this year, they are in the Champions League. But it was their lowest finish in terms of 5th since 2014-15. I think it was their lowest points tally since 2017-18. That's really disappointing. And if it hadn't been for this Champions League run, it wouldn't be totally surprising if they got rid of Edin Terzic this summer. And it does feel like there's now talk about him extending his deal. But having played so well in Marco Reus's final game for the club with Sabitzer, Füllkrug, Hummels. Well, Hummel's 35, let alone in his 30s, but all these players in their mid-30s. The future of Ian Maatsen and Sancho, a little bit uncertain. We expect Dortmund to make permanent moves to them, but not necessarily signed, sealed, delivered that is definitely happening yet. It felt like such a great opportunity, and to play that well for 48 minutes, 50 minutes or so before the tide started to turn was hugely disappointing. But you can only really credit them for their run, unlike Real Madrid, who in terms of XG, I put this in inverted commas because ultimately who cares when a trophy's been lifted. But in terms of XG, they lost to Leipzig, they lost to City, they lost in the final here, they beat Bayern Munich by XG. But that does show how much jeopardy there has been in this Champions League run. It feels like, you see them lifting another 15th and Ancelotti's raising his eyebrow once again. He'll get the cigars out. And you think, that was so straightforward. Actually, this year was probably the hardest, alongside that 2022 run, that I can really remember in this whole run of 6 in 11 years, really. It felt like they played particularly poorly against Leipzig. I think they were really outplayed against City in that second leg in particular. Did play a lot better against Bayern Munich, but it hasn't been a vintage Real Madrid season. But ultimately, they finished with 95 points in La Liga. They lost 2 games all year, and they've done so with Courtois injured, Alaba injured, Rudiger, having to hold up the whole back line, really. Rodrigo missing a lot of games as well. Bellingham adapting to a new side. And yet they have put together just a frighteningly good season in terms of stats. And actually, when it comes down to who dominated more or how much feeling there is around their ability in terms of dominating games, it doesn't ultimately matter. It doesn't really ultimately matter. We'll all remember it. But in 20 years, you'll just look back and think, 6 Champions Leagues in 11 years. So
what a breeze.
Fair play to them. But for Dortmund, opportunity missed. Massive credit to them for their run to get here, particularly against PSG in that first leg. I think they played really, really well. To come back against Atletico Madrid, given the situation they were in, huge props to them. But I suppose, Mikey, we probably should wrap up by talking about the Champions League final talking about the Champions League final by talking about some of the key performers. Carvajal you've already mentioned, but was there anyone else from Real Madrid that sort of really stood out?
Well, Toni Kroos in his final appearance for the club was absolutely excellent. Could have scored 2 free kicks. Gregor Kobel with 2 decent saves. Well, actually, the first one may have been going for the woodwork, to be fair, but he was just absolutely magnificent, especially in the second half. He completed 97% of his passes. He created 4 chances. An absolutely superb performance from him. Following another superb season from him, Toni Kroos. I think Toni Kroos is weirdly a midfielder who I feel like on this channel has caught a fair bit of flack over the years. One player who's had a bit of an agenda against over the years, or I feel like he always had good reasoning. But to be honest, when you look back at Toni Kroos's career in general, to bow out at 34 after I think one of his more impressive campaigns, I think just says a lot about the player. And I think were he not retiring, then I think Ancelotti would be far more keen to keep him on than Modric, if I'm honest. Luka Modric has been remarkable, but this season there's no doubt that Toni Kroos has been the more influential player. Luka Modric has not been a starter this year, and without him, where does that midfield? What does that midfield look like in next year? Even with Kylian Mbappé coming in, with Kroos no longer there, does Camavinga step into his role, or do we see Bellingham have to take more of a conventional 8 role in Kroos's absence? I think that'll be really interesting to see. Of course, Vinicius Junior we have to talk about as well in terms of his performance. Completed 8 dribbles on the night, and I think this was one thing that always did feel a bit inevitable, was that Vinicius up against Ryerson was just a huge mismatch. I know Ryerson has impressed at points this season, but there's very few right backs in the world. I think kind of Kyle Walker famously an exception in terms of players who can actually deal with Vinicius down the left. And even when Real Madrid looked far from their best in the first half, Vinicius was still a relatively consistent threat. He was still able to break into the box from the left wing with relative ease. So it always felt like he was going to get his moment at some stage in the match. So I feel like for Real Madrid, they were the two key men. But you can look across that Dortmund team, like Schlotterbeck and Hummels, once again brilliant in the Champions League. Hummels, if Adeyemi scores that first chance he gets, then people would have been talking about that Hummels pass for years. How many players does that dissect? About 5 or 6. Absolutely brilliant from him. I thought Emre Can, particularly in the first half, had a really strong game as well. Adeyemi, yes, aside from those misses, which I think, like you say, dudes, I think he's still very young, but I think there's, if he's going to actually reach the elite level, then he needs to find that killer instinct, as you were saying. But again, a really consistent threat. Nicholas Füllkrug worked really, really hard, and unfortunately hit the inside of the post, and
it was a good effort.
And of course, almost brought them back were it not for being offside in the 86th minute as well with that header. A number of key performers out there, Dukes. But I guess before we wrap up entirely, I've touched on it already, but Kylian Mbappé now confirmed to Real Madrid. Fabrizio
I, for one, was
Romano.
shocked. Did not see it coming.
Didn't see it coming at all. Fabrizio Romano saving the news until Real Madrid fans were celebrating on Sunday. Even Jude Bellingham was talking about it post-match with Mbappé, saying, how, despite all their success this season, Real Madrid are still missing a killer number 9. And I guess it's
disrespectful to Joselu, but
yeah, exactly. You wouldn't be in the Champions League final without Joselu's heroics against Bayern Munich. But I guess it begs the question, Dukes. Actually, let's quickly just go over, for anyone who doesn't know, Mbappé is taking quite a significant pay cut to go to Real Madrid, 15 million euros a year after tax, a signing on bonus of 100 million euros. This all seems like huge money, and it is, of course. But I mean, he was earning 75 million euros gross in his final season at PSG.
Wow.
He was earning 30 million euros a year from a signing on bonus as well. So this actually does represent a bit of a pay cut for him.
Just doing it for the love of the game.
Doing it for the love of the game, nothing more than that. And of course, PSG, despite losing him for free, they do, as a result of paying him so much, do free up a lot in terms of wages and general costs. I think at least 220 million euros per year. But Endrick also arriving this summer at Real, obviously only 17 years old. You imagine he'll be eased into first team action rather than given a starring role from the get-go. But it does beg the question, having seen Ancelotti adapt to Benzema's loss by playing Jude Bellingham in that kind of weird free role behind two split strikers this year. Mbappé now comes in. Mbappé has played the majority of his football at PSG off the left, or at least in more recent seasons, especially since Neymar left. Where do you see, how do you see Ancelotti adapting this attack once again?
It's going to be interesting, isn't it? I think the thing that I'm most intrigued by is the fact that they are moving, or they're either compensating by moving the best player in the world in Kylian Mbappé and probably playing him centrally, or they're moving the player that probably should win the Balon d'Or if it was voted for tomorrow. And if English players do get overhyped, and Bellingham is kind of the story of Real Madrid's season, but actually probably Vinicius Junior has probably had a better season in terms of...
He certainly had a better second half of the season.
Yeah, I think he's definitely... And I think Vinicius Junior has kind of taken his game to an even bigger level this year. And Bellingham, has been exceptional, but there's been probably less real star moments as opposed to... It was just like relentless accumulation of goals in the first part of the season. Whereas Vinicius Junior, I think, has really kind of almost carried that attack at points, given the change of system, given... the loss of Benzema. He has really been Real Madrid's focal point. Again, a second goal in a Champions League final. I would like to see Vinicius Junior, if it was voted for today, win the Balon d'Or. Unfortunately, I mean, we'll see what happens with the Copa America. We'll see what happens with the Euros. That will probably have a big say on it as well. But Kylian Mbappé, I think, might just... I mean, he's shown willing by taking this pay cut. I mean, he's still being paid a ridiculous amount of money, but he has taken a huge pay cut. Will he show willing and be like, I've got my dream move. I'm at the club that I've always wanted to join. I'll play kind of wherever. I'll play as a 9, and I'll stop complaining like I did at points at PSG about not wanting to play as the focal point. So that'll be absolutely intriguing. But if Bellingham is dropping back into midfield, that kind of could potentially save them a bit of money in terms of a Kroos replacement. That is one more body in midfield. But you've kind of seen how dangerous he is as a final third player these days. And really, that has kind of surprised me, because at Dortmund, I thought his best work was kind of driving from midfield a bit deeper. And he still can do that. He's such an amazing all-round player. But Bellingham and Kroos are quite different style of players. Bellingham's much less of an orchestrator. He's much less of a passer. He's more about his physical attributes. That'll be a slight shift. But it feels like with the way football is going at the moment, it's really about physical dominance. It's really about legs. Valverde and Bellingham either side of Camavinga or Tchouaméni. It's still an exceptional midfield. So I'm not too worried. I'm not too worried about any of this. And as you say, we could be entering another period. Well, we're already kind of in it, but they could easily hoover up another 3 or 4 in the next 4 or 5 years. It feels like they will pretty much be the favourite every year after next year, where it will probably still be Man City. So it does slightly worry me for the state of European football. And I still even think, judging by watching it where we were in London Bridge on Saturday, people aren't bored of Real Madrid at the moment. And I think it's because there's always jeopardy in their games. But actually, you could enter a period where, Ancelotti might not be there for years. Who knows? Maybe they'll change manager and it'll be a more sort of dominant style that they'll introduce. And they could just hoover up and just, from 2014 to 2030, just win a ridiculous amount of Champions Leagues. And we might become a bit bored of it quite quickly, which I do slightly fear for.
They certainly seem to have the most secure future of any club at the moment, especially in terms of the age of those players. I guess back on Mbappé, I think what will be interesting to see is that, Mbappé is entering, a club where he really won't be able to just get his own way at all. PSG, he entered a project which, yes, there were strong personalities there. You know, they had Thiago Silva as captain. Marquinhos had been there for a number of years. They had, you know, Marco Verratti had been there for a number of years. But it still felt like when Neymar and Mbappe entered that club that they became very quickly the figureheads because they hadn't won a Champions League yet, because they represented a kind of what was supposed to be a new glorious era for the club. Whereas Mbappe's entering a side that's won 6 Champions Leagues. They still have Luka Modric on the books, Dani Carvajal still there. You know, they've got really strong leadership figures in someone like David Alaba, the amount of experience that he has, even Antonio Rudiger, even Bellingham, who is, you know, 5 years younger than Mbappe, but has already become a very vocal member of that team. And playing under, you know, a winning manager as well. I just don't think Mbappe is going to hold the same amount of gravitas at Real Madrid that he does otherwise, and I think he will have to adapt. You know, this is his dream move, and you know, yes, he's kicked up a fuss in the past, but he's not an idiot. Like I think Mbappe will have to adapt, and I think that can only really be a good thing for his career. Yep. To be honest, I feel like we could see him hit a whole new level at Real Madrid, actually. Kind
of growing up in terms of his less public pronouncements off the pitch, and less sort of
just less noise. I just think there's going to be less noise around him, because there already is so much noise around Real Madrid anyway. I think in some ways there will be less noise around him as a character. I know, obviously, like Il Chiringuito will be discussing him every single night of the week for the next, you know, for 10 years or whatever. But I think the general noise around him will, it won't be the same as it was at PSG, where there's this kind of this thing of like, well, he never delivered a Champions League, so what right does he have to be like this? I think he won't be able to kick up as much of a fuss, and you know, he's going to be part of a more successful team most likely.
That is the thing as well. I feel like, for all the criticisms, and rightly so, for Flo Perez in the early part of his presidency, you know, he has managed to rebuild the Bernabeu, completely redevelop the sort of transfer strategy from that club, bring through a perfectly ready next generation of stars to replace these legends that they've had for the last 10 years, and sign the best player in the world, and they're not bankrupt. You know, it is quite like the financial management of that club in the last 10 years has been pretty exceptional at a time when PSG, City are run by nation states. You know, Real Madrid have, you know, I'm not playing the violins for Real Madrid, but what they've done in the last 10 years in terms of setting themselves up for the next 10, 15 years is pretty remarkable, really. It's pretty faultless.
Yeah. And I think it was interesting, like in the build-up to the Champions League final, you know, Dortmund announcing this partnership with you know, a prominent arms company, that people were like, well, even the moral choice now is potentially Real Madrid going to this final, of course. And of course, you know, Dortmund fans very vocal in their dissent against this deal. You know, banners up at Wembley. You know, fan groups in general very, very much against this deal, despite, you know, Hans-Joachim Watzke being incredibly for it, and trying to justify it by saying it's future-proofing democracy, which is pretty crazy talk, in my opinion. But yeah, back to Real Madrid. It's also funny to think that, you know, only 3-4 years ago, Madrid fans were a bit worried about their lack of spending in the transfer market, you know, especially over, you know, during those COVID years, you know, there was almost nothing spent. And, you know, I think that was partly also the result of, you know, their last real miss, which was the Eden Hazard transfer in 2019. I think that certainly had an effect on their spending. But, you know, it just took a little bit of patience. It just took holding with someone like Vinicius, waiting for him to become a world-class player. And, you know, if they go on and sign someone like Alphonso Davies, I know like the noise around that has been a bit less recently, but it's still a possibility. Then they've got almost the best player in the world in each position. It's absolutely frightening. Especially given, you know, when you look at a side like Man City, you know, Kevin De Bruyne aging out. that back line, man for man, I don't know if it necessarily. I don't think it's necessarily better than Real Madrid at this point.
Bernardo Silva's future a bit uncertain.
Yeah, Kyle Walker's getting no younger either, and they are the kind of yardstick that you measure any top club to at this point. And you have to say that Real Madrid in 2 or 3 years' time, it's hard not to see them being clearly better than a side like Man City, clearly better than a side like PSG, like Bayern Munich, most probably as well. The future is scary for anyone who's not a Real Madrid fan.
We need Erik ten Hag's tricky Reds to take a step forward to knock them off their perch. No,
absolutely.
What a ridiculous note to end on. But I have really enjoyed today's Monday Vibes. I hope you guys have as well. Check us out on Snapchat as well. We drop 3 videos a week on Snapchat. I hope you guys have enjoyed this week's episode. Let us know your thoughts about the final and Mbappe in the comment section, and we'll see you later. Bye-bye.